In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 3 of the text concerning legal issues associated with police operations. Um, Before the second half of the 1900s, there weren't a lot of Supreme Court cases addressing police activity, at the state level at least. There really was very limited application of the Constitution at all to police proceedings at the state and local level before 1960s, really. Some important things to note with looking at the effect of um, proper criminal procedure with police operations is the difference between reasonable suspicion and probable cause. Probable cause means that the police have collected enough evidence through whatever observations, witness statements, victim statements, collection of physical evidence, observations that they personally have seen, um, to arrest someone. Um, Enough evidence to arrest. Reasonable suspicion is that based on the information that's been presented to them, the evidence that's been presented to them, they think that something might have happened or that something might be likely to about to happen, but it's not necessarily enough information to arrest someone. Um, if the police have suspicions about someone's um, potential likelihood to commit criminal activity and they want to investigate further, for instance, having reasonable suspicion is enough to detain someone and ask them questions. Not necessarily arrest them, but to keep them in a place until you can sort out what's happening. Um, if through that process the police find out that there is, they find more evidence, then that can raise the probable cause and the person can be arrested. Um, it's important to note that if the police have reasonable suspicion and the person that they are suspicious of um, does not want to cooperate with their questions, that in and of itself can raise it to the level of probable cause for an arrest. That's only if there was pre-existing reasonable suspicion, and that's something that the police have got to get better about articulating to someone. What's when they are voluntarily being asked questions versus where they're being questioned in an investigation pursuant to reasonable suspicion. So it's very important that the police get better about communicating things like that and those levels and when they've been crossed to citizens. That's really what causes a lot of these negative police interactions is when the police are formally talking to someone after they have reasonable suspicion to believe that a crime has taken place. The individual needs to know that. They need to know that their actions from that point on might be different from a position where the police don't have reasonable suspicion. And it's also important to note what the exclusionary rule is. It basically means that evidence that is collected illegally, unconstitutionally, is excluded from trial. There are some exceptions to that. You need to read the cases that are listed in the text about some of the exceptions to the exclusionary rule. But for the most part, evidence of a crime that is collected illegally or improperly is excluded from trial. Further, any anything that comes from that evidence is known as fruit of the poisonous tree and cannot be used. So if the police find one piece of evidence that leads them to another piece of evidence, but the first piece of evidence was gained improperly, that second piece of evidence, regardless of if it was legal or not, if it came from the information gained in the illegal evidence to begin with, it's fruit of the poisonous tree. I mean, again, there are several exceptions to the exclusionary rule, good faith exception, for instance. So make sure to read those. Read those Supreme Court cases listed in the text. Also, if some of those cases are interesting to you all, I would encourage you to search for them online, and you can get the full text of what happened in the case, as opposed to just a little 2 or 3 line blurb that's in the textbook here for all the cases. Um, Also important to note the difference in police encounters. They list 3 levels in the text. The first being consensual encounters, where people are just free to leave in any situation. One thing that's important to note that there is no requirement if you are a witness to a crime or some event. There is no requirement for you to give testimony to police. Um, there, in case you might say something that would incriminate yourself, but there's no requirement to provide testimony to police. Um, the two sort of formal levels that we have for police encounters are a stop and frisk, which is typically based off of reasonable suspicion that a crime has occurred, is occurring, or is very likely to occur in the future, and then an arrest. Again, an arrest being based off of probable cause, meaning that in the police's opinion, based on the evidence and the nature of the circumstances that they're in, that it is more likely than not that a crime has taken place. Um, an arrest is considered a seizure of a person. So typically, that seizure is going to be based on either the probable cause that is available to the police immediately surrounding the environment that they're in, or through the issuance of a search warrant, which is based on the police going to a judge offering what's known as an affidavit, which is basically stating the evidence that they've collected, their beliefs about a particular case. If the judge feels that that has reached probable cause, they will issue a arrest warrant for the individual, or a search warrant if that's what they're looking for. They're trying to search a particular area to get the evidence that would then lead to an arrest. It really just depends on what type of warrant is being issued. There are some very important sort of caveats to the requirement for a warrant. 2 times when a warrant is not needed is one, if it's in plain view. If the police can see something, for instance, if someone has a lit blunt hanging out of the ashtray of the car when the police come up, that's not going to be, a pro-social decision. Or if they have an open beer can, or there is in the film Blow, when the police pull over the main character and his wife, and he's had cocaine spread all over him from a burst bag in the car. Things like that. You don't have to have a warrant because, again, they're in plain view. The other is open fields doctrine, which says that in open areas, for instance, public spaces, parks, popular street areas, there is no right to privacy. You typically only have a right to privacy in areas that you own, or areas that you're living in and acting as your domicile. So if it's in plain view, or you're in an open space, there's no right to privacy. Another pretty common misconception about police and citizen interactions is when the Miranda warning has to be issued. It only has to be issued when the police are going to ask questions, when they're basically going to engage in an interrogation. Just because someone is arrested doesn't mean they have to have the Miranda rights read to them. There's no requirement. It doesn't void the arrest. The rights only come when the police are going to interrogate someone to inform them of their right to shut up, which should be the game plan. I tell my classes, and I feel like it's a different tone online, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it anyway. Your number one step is not to commit crimes. That should be pretty easy. Just don't commit crimes. Okay. 2. If you're going to commit crimes, and again, step 1 is not to commit crimes, but if you do commit crimes, step 2 is not getting caught. Okay. Step 3, again, don't commit crimes, but if you do commit crimes, try not to get caught. If you get caught, shut up. No one has ever helped themselves by talking to the police when they are being investigated. I'm not telling you to commit crimes. I'm not telling you to circumvent police operations. I'm saying when you are the suspect, shut your mouth, let your attorney talk. That's the best advice I can give anyone at any time for any reason. No one has ever helped themselves by talking to the police in these situations. So you need to talk to your attorney, let your attorney talk to the police. You also need to make sure you have an attorney that's only looking out for your interests. Sometimes People that are involved in shady shit um, might have a lawyer paid for by the person that they're in the shady shit with. You don't want to do that either. You want to look out for your own best interest whenever you are the subject of a police investigation. But again, rule number one, and please say it with me at your houses: do not commit crimes. Okay, rule number one. So it's important to note that in interrogations, the Miranda warning only has to be given when questions are going to be asked. It's also important to look at the effect of civil liability in terms of its role in the criminal justice system. There are several types, or the two types of torts, which are basically harms in the civil system that can be brought against police officers, either intentional torts or negligent torts. Intentional torts are excessive force, assault or battery on an individual, or false arrest. Um, a lot of these are hard to prove, and they are easier to prove when we have body cams of a lot of these incidences, which is why police at all times should be wearing body cameras. Like if if you don't have your business out in the bathroom to do your business, then you should be wearing the body camera should be on. And it reduces a lot of frivolous complaints against the police, but it also gives us the ability to check the behavior of police. The other type is negligent torts, which have to occur during the operation of police activities, and that an average person would see them as being negligent. An example of that, recently, a local case, a Georgia State officer was speeding to a case, to a call which he really didn't need to be going that fast, and ran a light and T-boned a car that was going through a green light and killed one of the passengers. And was later found civilly liable because it wasn't really that much of an emergency situation that they had to run through the light. They're supposed to slow down at the lights to make sure that there's no traffic coming before they proceed through a red light. And none of those things happened, and it resulted in in a death. Something like that would have to be satisfied for the negligent level. There's also crimes committed, violations of federal court, and it's important to note that the same action can bring a state proceeding and a federal proceeding, as long as that one action violated state precedent and also federal precedent for either a color of law violation, basically using your office to intimidate someone, or to act as a use of force to try to prevent someone from doing something or force someone to do something, or also a civil rights violation, the violation of the action being in violation of the typically the 4th, 5th, or 14th Amendment are the most common violations that happen with police officers. So if something does happen that is in violation of both of those things, and it's not hard for that to happen. A violation of the, an excessive force complaint could be a police-related killing, which is going to be a 4th Amendment violation against an illegal seizure, and potentially a civil rights violation, 14th Amendment as well. So it's not hard for these cases to be potentially applicable on multiple levels. Some of the emerging issues that are related to the way police operate within the procedural aspects of the criminal justice system: community policing. What the community wants the police to do. That's something that needs to be looked at and addressed a lot, because it doesn't make sense to do police programs if a community isn't worried about a particular type of offense, or if they're more worried about another type of offense. Knowing what the needs and the wants of a community are very important to effectively using police resources, efficiently using police resources, but also building the relationship between the police and the community. Because right now, it's shitty. There's a big gap between the police and the community, and both sides aren't trying to build a bridge; they're just yelling at each other right now. So it takes a lot of effort on both sides. It's going to take a lot of effort on both sides to get that gap bridged. Also, looking at the idea of zero tolerance policing and appreciating the harm that that has done. We'll talk about it in the next PowerPoint about zero tolerance policing more specifically, and how it's been it was sort of a bastardization of a type of theory that came out in the early 80s. But that's something that's also been very detrimental to the cohesion between the communities and the police that serve them. Use of force, when to use force, what levels of force to use. We seem to be in a position as a country where that's going to have to be recalibrated. And really on both sides, the expectations of the police, but also the expectations of the community. For instance, a very, I say ignorant, and I mean uninformed opinion that people have is the idea of why don't police shoot people in the arm or the leg. And people that say that are people that have almost exclusively never fired a firearm before. They've seen it done in a movie and think that it's easy to hit a flailing, moving target. The reason that police officers shoot to kill is because they shoot center mass, because they have a higher likelihood of hitting, and also a higher likelihood of ending the situation, which unfortunately has resulted in a lot of deaths. So there needs to be, again, a change of when the police officers shoot, because when they do, it's a lethal force. It's a lethal level on the force spectrum. So when it is implemented, it's going to have that outcome, but we need to examine when we're implementing that. A lot of the negative aspects and the negative opinions of the police have resulted in something also known as depolicing, where police don't respond to calls quickly. In some of the more crime-ridden areas of Chicago, there have been stories of police officers stopping at stoplights on the way to a shooting call or a murder call, and other types of sort of passive ways that police officers have neglected to basically they feel like they are being targeted and being criticized unduly, and their response is this passive aggressive refusal to do the jobs they're supposed to be doing. And again, it's not helping the situation. It's not helping build the gaps with the community. And it's another instance of how far apart we are. Another thing that's come up too, and has been a very decisive issue, is the idea of defunding the police, which does not mean removal of a police force. It doesn't mean getting rid of half the police officers. One way that we could address this issue and have an ability to put less funding into police operations is by changing what we expect police officers to do. So when we tell them go fight the war on drugs, that's very costly in terms of expenses, manpower, resources. Also costly on the community and the effect that it's had of removing 2 generations of family forming males from these populations. If you are an African American male in this country, you have a 1 in 3 chance statistically of going to prison at some point in your life. That has been supported and created by the war on drugs and the way that that's been enforced. So we've asked police to do an impossible job with basically just enough resources to keep the sort of cycle going, keep the wheel turning. And now we've gotten to a point where it's extremely cumbersome financially to pay for these services every year, paying for SWAT raids, paying for armored, having all the body armor and weapons that it takes to fight the war on drugs, to fight the escalating um, violent forces of the drug operations. When really there's better ways of addressing that. There's logistical ways. There's um, sort of white collar based ways to address um, the large organizations that are causing this war on drugs, or causing this flood of drugs and addiction. Um, Instead of just relying on the police to basically be fighting a ever changing and expanding front line. So the police themselves, you really look at it, which again, a lot of the problem is that people aren't taking honest looks at these situations. Um, Defunding the police could be a good thing for them. It could mean that they're having to do, I think the technical term is less dumb shit than they have before, and so we don't have to rely on them forcibly working overtime hours or having to do dangerous assignments. Some of the dangerous assignments could go away, and those operations could be less costly. Not necessarily reducing the number of officers, reducing the pay that they have. Those things aren't going to work. But if we're having them, the operational costs are less. We could really see some headway, and how much money we're actually putting into these things. And then if they're not doing those other things, those war on drug things, they could be doing other things. They could be investigating crimes that we want them to investigate. They could be doing community outreach. They could be shooting cats out of trees. The things that police officers are supposed to do, the things that they did before the war on drugs.